The autumn breeze rustled through the trees as a young boy stood at the entrance of Riverside Middle School, his heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. His perfectly maintained locks swayed gently in the wind as he adjusted his backpack. This was Alex's first day at a new school, and like any 12-year-old in his situation, he couldn't help but wonder what adventures and challenges lay ahead. What most people at Riverside didn't know was that Alex's father, Dr. Thompson, had just been appointed as the new principal. They had decided to keep this information private for now, wanting Alex to have a chance to make friends and settle in naturally without the pressure of being the principal's son. The hallways buzzed with the usual morning energy as Alex made his way to his first class. Students rushed past, some giving him curious glances while others were too absorbed in their own conversations to notice the new face among them. He found his way to room 204, where Mrs. Wilson's science class awaited. Mrs. Wilson, a teacher who had been at Riverside for 15 years, stood at the door greeting students. The moment her eyes fell on Alex, something in her expression changed. It was subtle. A slight tightening around her mouth, a narrowing of her eyes, but noticeable enough to make Alex's stomach do a tiny flip. "Well, well," she said, her voice carrying a hint of disapproval. "You must be our new student." Her eyes lingered on his hair, and she made no attempt to hide her scrutiny. "We have very specific standards of professionalism at this school." Alex straightened his shoulders, remembering his father's words from that morning. "Stand tall, be yourself, and let your work speak for itself." He responded politely, "Yes, ma'am. I'm excited to join your class." As the days passed, Alex quickly proved himself to be one of the brightest students in class. His hand was often the first to rise when questions were asked, and his assignments consistently earned top marks. Other students began to warm up to him, impressed by his friendly nature and willingness to help others understand difficult concepts. But Mrs. Wilson's behavior became increasingly concerning. She would often interrupt Alex's answers with unnecessary corrections or dismiss his contributions entirely. During lab work, she would hover over his shoulder, scrutinizing his every move while largely ignoring other students who clearly needed help. One particular morning, as Alex presented his homework on cellular structure, Mrs. Wilson interrupted him mid-sentence. "Your hair is distracting the class," she announced loudly, though no one had been paying any attention to his hair. "Please tie it back, or you'll have to see the office about it." The class fell silent. Alex's classmate Riley, who sat next to him, whispered, "But Jack never has to tie his hair back, and his is longer." Several other students nodded in agreement, uncomfortable with the obvious unfairness of the situation. Alex handled the situation with remarkable composure for someone so young. He quietly took a hair tie from his backpack and secured his locks, then continued his presentation without missing a beat. His classmates watched with growing respect, not just for his intelligence, but for his dignity in the face of unfair treatment. What Mrs. Wilson didn't realize was that each incident was being carefully documented. Alex's father had taught him the importance of keeping a record of such interactions, and Alex maintained a detailed journal of every comment and incident, complete with dates and witnesses. The tension in the science classroom continued to build, though Alex never let it affect his performance. He maintained his straight A's, participated actively in class discussions, and even joined the science club. Other teachers began to notice his exceptional performance and positive attitude, creating a stark contrast with Mrs. Wilson's unexplained hostility. As the first month drew to a close, whispers began circulating through the school about the upcoming science fair. Alex's eyes lit up when he heard about it. He had already started developing ideas for a project on renewable energy, something he was passionate about. But when he saw his name on Mrs. Wilson's list of project advisors, he couldn't help but worry about what challenges lay ahead. Little did anyone know that this science fair would set in motion a chain of events that would shake Riverside Middle School to its very foundation, revealing truths that some would rather keep hidden, and testing the limits of both cruelty and courage in ways no one could have anticipated. The story was just beginning, and the quiet new student with the perfectly maintained locks would soon find himself at the center of a situation that would change not just his life, but the entire school community forever. As autumn turned the leaves golden outside Riverside Middle School, the atmosphere inside Mrs. Wilson's science classroom grew increasingly tense. Alex had been at the school for 6 weeks now, and what had started as supple disapproval from his science teacher had evolved into something more concerning. One crisp morning, Alex arrived early to set up his materials for a group project. He was carefully arranging his notes when Mrs. Wilson walked in, her heels clicking sharply against the linoleum floor. "I see someone's trying to show off again," she remarked loudly, though no other students were present. "You know, drawing attention to yourself isn't always a good thing." Alex pretended to be absorbed in organizing his papers, his father's words echoing in his mind. "Your dignity is not determined by how others treat you, but by how you respond to that treatment." He had been writing down every interaction in his journal, just as his dad had suggested, never imagining how important this documentation would become. During class that day, Mrs. Wilson seemed determined to find fault with everything Alex did. When he raised his hand to answer a question about photosynthesis, she ignored him completely. When he finally spoke up after no other students volunteered, she cut him off mid-sentence. "Perhaps," she said with a tight smile, "we should give other students a chance to learn, instead of having you dominate every discussion." The irony was that she had just spent 5 minutes trying to get anyone else to answer. Alex's classmates were becoming increasingly uncomfortable with the situation. Riley, who sat next to him, would often share concerned glances with other students. Even Mr. Parker, the history teacher next door, had started finding excuses to pop into the science classroom during lessons, his presence seemingly triggered by Mrs. Wilson's raised voice. During lunch breaks, Alex found unexpected support from his classmates. "She's totally unfair to you," said Chris, sharing his cookies with Alex. "My brother had long hair last year, and she never said anything to him about it." Other students nodded in agreement, and Alex felt grateful for their support, though he never complained or spoke ill of Mrs. Wilson. The situation reached a new level when Alex's group project presentation day arrived. His team had created an impressive model demonstrating the water cycle, with Alex taking the lead on the technical aspects. As they presented, Mrs. Wilson interrupted repeatedly, questioning every detail of Alex's contribution while praising his teammates excessively. "Are you sure you did this part yourself?" she asked pointedly, gesturing to the complex diagram Alex had drawn. "It seems a bit advanced figure level." The implication in her tone was clear, and Alex's teammates shifted uncomfortably. "Actually," piped up Tommy, one of his group members, "Alex taught us how to do the calculations. He even stayed after school to help me understand it better." Other students began nodding and sharing similar stories of Alex's helpfulness. Mrs. Wilson's face tightened, and she quickly moved on to the next group. But something had shifted in the classroom. The students had spoken up, and their unity was palpable. Between classes, other teachers began to notice Alex's stellar performance in their subjects. Ms. Rodriguez, the math teacher, often used his problem-solving methods as examples for the class. Mr. Chen, who taught English, praised Alex's creative writing and analytical skills. Their positive treatment made Mrs. Wilson's behavior stand out even more starkly. One day, after another tense science class, Mr. Parker pulled Alex aside in the hallway. "You're handling this situation with remarkable maturity," he said quietly. "Just keep doing what you're doing, and remember that more people are watching than you might think." What Mr. Parker didn't know was that Alex had been carefully following his father's advice about documentation. His journal now contained dates, times, and detailed accounts of every incident, including the names of witnesses. He even had voice recordings from class discussions on his phone, all perfectly legal in a public school setting. As the science fair approached, the tension in room 204 seemed to reach a breaking point. Alex's project proposal on sustainable energy had been met with unprecedented scrutiny from Mrs. Wilson, while similar proposals from other students were approved without question. Little did anyone know that the science fair would become the catalyst for events that would expose long-hidden biases and force the entire school community to confront uncomfortable truths. The quiet strength Alex had shown was about to be tested in ways no one could have predicted, and the consequences would reach far beyond the walls of Riverside Middle School. The day of the Riverside Middle School Science Fair arrived with a buzz of excitement filling the gymnasium. Colorful display boards lined the tables, and proud students stood beside their projects, eager to share their discoveries. Alex had arrived extra early to set up his sustainable energy demonstration, a working model that showed how solar and wind power could be combined to power a small community. His display was impressive. A miniature town with tiny LED lights that actually lit up, powered by both a small solar panel and a wind turbine he'd built himself. He'd spent countless hours perfecting every detail, working late into the night in his family's garage. His father had watched from the doorway sometimes, offering encouragement but never interfering, knowing this was something Alex needed to accomplish on his own. Mrs. Wilson, clipboard in hand, moved between the projects with the other judges. As one of the senior science teachers, she had a significant say in the judging process. Alex noticed how she lingered at other displays, nodding appreciatively and making detailed notes. But when she approached his table, her expression was already set in stone. "Well," she said, barely glancing at his project, "I suppose this is interesting." She made a show of writing something on her clipboard, her pen moving with sharp, disapproving strokes. What she didn't know was that the other judges had already been by earlier. Mr. Chen, who taught physics at the high school, had spent nearly 20 minutes asking Alex detailed questions about his energy calculations. Dr. Roberts, a local environmental scientist, had been particularly impressed by the practical applications Alex had included in his research. As the morning progressed, more and more students, teachers, and parents gathered around Alex's display. His project wasn't just visually appealing, it worked. When he demonstrated how the combined energy sources could power different parts of his model town, even the youngest visitors could understand the concept. He explained everything in simple terms, his enthusiasm infectious as he showed how clean energy could make a real difference in people's lives. Mrs. Wilson kept walking past, her frown deepening with each growing crowd at Alex's station. During one of his demonstrations, she stood at the back, arms crossed, watching as the principal of the elementary school next door praised Alex's clear explanation of complex concepts. The breaking point came just before the final judging. Alex was in the middle of showing a group of younger students how the wind turbine worked when Mrs. Wilson approached his table again. She was carrying a large bottle of water, supposedly to refill the judge's water cooler. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. As she passed behind Alex's display, her elbow accidentally knocked into his project. The water bottle tipped, spilling its contents directly onto the electrical components of his model town. The small crowd gasped as water poured over the display. The LED lights flickered and went dark. Papers curled at the edges, and part of his carefully constructed landscape began to dissolve. "Oh my," Mrs. Wilson said, her voice dripping with fake concern. "What a terrible accident. I'm so sorry." But the slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth told a different story. Alex stood frozen for a moment, staring at his ruined project. Months of work, countless hours of research and construction, all seemingly destroyed in seconds. The silence in his corner of the gymnasium was deafening. But then something remarkable happened. Without missing a beat, Alex took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Actually," he said calmly, "this gives me a perfect opportunity to demonstrate another important aspect of sustainable energy systems, their resilience and adaptability." He began explaining how real-world renewable energy systems are designed to withstand various weather conditions. As he talked, he carefully disconnected the wet components, showing how the modular design meant that even if one part was damaged, other sections could still function. To everyone's amazement, he managed to get part of his display working again within minutes. The crowd was impressed not just by his quick thinking, but by his composure. Several parents were filming the entire incident on their phones, captured both the accident and Alex's impressive recovery. Mr. Parker, who had been watching from nearby, quickly brought paper towels and helped Alex salvage what he could. Other students pitched in too, holding pieces steady as Alex reconnected wires and explained the backup systems he'd built into his project. As the final judging approached, it became clear that Alex's handling of the crisis had only made his presentation more impactful. He demonstrated not just scientific knowledge, but real problem-solving skills under pressure. The other judges huddled together, talking in low voices and glancing between their score sheets and Mrs. Wilson, who stood apart, her face unreadable. No one could have predicted that this accident would be just the beginning. The real storm was yet to come. and the events of the science fair would soon seem like mere tremors compared to what lay ahead. The Monday after the science fair started like any other day at Riverside Middle School. Despite Mrs. Wilson's attempt to sabotage his project, Alex had won second place overall, with the judges particularly impressed by his quick thinking and professionalism during the water incident. This seemed to push Mrs. Wilson past some invisible breaking point. During their morning science class, Mrs. Wilson announced they would be doing a special experiment involving different adhesives and their properties. The students paired up at their lab stations, putting on their safety goggles and following the instruction sheet she handed out. Alex was working with his lab partner Chris, carefully measuring and testing how different glues reacted with various materials. Their results were promising, and they were actually enjoying the experiment despite Mrs. Wilson's constant hovering around their station. "Look how precise their measurements are," whispered Riley to her partner at the next table. Several other students nodded in agreement, impressed by Alex and Chris's methodical approach. Mrs. Wilson's face tightened as she overheard these comments. The classroom was filled with the usual sounds of middle school science, the scratch of pencils on paper, the quiet murmur of students discussing their observations, and the occasional excited exclamation when something unexpected happened. Nobody noticed Mrs. Wilson slip into the supply closet at the back of the room. When she emerged, she was carrying what looked like an extra bottle of adhesive. "I need to check how you're all measuring the substances," she announced, moving between the tables. But she seemed to be making a beeline for Alex's station. As she approached their table, Chris had just gotten up to get more paper towels. Alex was bent over their notebook, recording their latest observations. Later, students would recall seeing something unusual in Mrs. Wilson's expression, a strange mix of determination and something else they couldn't quite name. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion, yet was over in seconds. Mrs. Wilson stood directly behind Alex, reaching over as if to check their measurement beaker. Then, with a movement too deliberate to be accidental, she opened the bottle she was holding and poured its contents over Alex's head, focusing particularly on his locks. The classroom fell silent. The kind of silence that rings in your ears and makes time stand still. Alex remained frozen in his seat, feeling the cold liquid seeping through his hair. The sharp chemical smell told him immediately this wasn't ordinary school glue, it was industrial-strength super glue. A few drops fell onto his lab worksheet, instantly bonding the paper to the table. That's when the reality of what had just happened hit everyone in the room. "Oh dear," Mrs. Wilson said, her voice falsely sweet. "The bottle must have been defective. These things happen sometimes." But her words fell flat in the shocked silence of the classroom. Chris, returning with paper towels, stopped dead in his tracks. Riley had her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. In the back of the room, Tommy was already pulling out his phone, recording everything. Alex didn't cry, didn't scream, didn't move. He sat perfectly still, his hands gripping the edges of his lab stool, his back straight as a rod. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady though quiet. "I need to go to the nurse's office." That's when the spell of silence broke. Several students started talking at once. "I saw her do it on purpose." She squeezed the bottle. "I got it all on video." Someone called the principal. Mrs. Wilson's face had gone pale, but she maintained her act. Now, class. Accidents happen in science labs. That's why we have procedures." She was interrupted by Mr. Parker bursting through the door. The commotion had carried through the walls, and he'd come to investigate. One look at the scene. Alex sitting motionless with super glue dripping down his neck, students with phones out recording, Mrs. Wilson still holding the empty bottle, and he understood. "Everyone except Alex and Mrs. Wilson, please go to the library," he said firmly. "Take your phones with you." He turned to Chris. "Please go to the nurse's office. Tell her we need her here immediately, and then go directly to the principal's office." As students filed out, many patted Alex's shoulder gently or whispered words of support. Through it all, he remained still, his dignity intact despite the awful situation. Mr. Parker picked up the classroom phone, his voice low and urgent as he made another call. What no one in the room knew yet was that this moment would become a turning point not just for Alex and Mrs. Wilson, but for the entire school. The next few hours would reveal truths that had long been hidden and set in motion changes that would impact every person in the building. Little did Mrs. Wilson know, but her attempt to humiliate Alex would instead expose something much deeper about herself, and the consequences would reach far beyond anything she could have anticipated. The nurse's office at Riverside Middle School had never felt so tense. Alex sat quietly on the examination bed, still maintaining his composure despite the super glue hardening in his hair. The school nurse, Mrs. Chen, was carefully examining the damage while trying to hide her own distress at the situation. "We need to call your emergency contact right away," Mrs. Chen said softly, reaching for the student contact list. She dialed the number and spoke briefly into the phone, her eyes widening slightly at the response. Meanwhile, in the main office, chaos was brewing. Students who had witnessed the incident were coming forward one by one, showing their phone recordings to the assistant principal. The videos were clear and damning. There was no way this could be dismissed as an accident. Mrs. Wilson sat in a chair outside the principal's office, her face ashen. She kept mumbling about classroom accidents and no real harm done, but her hands were shaking as she clutched her purse. Several teachers walked past, each giving her looks that ranged from disappointment to outright disgust. The main office door opened and footsteps echoed down the hallway. Mrs. Wilson looked up, expecting to see Alex's parents, probably angry but unfamiliar faces she could somehow handle. Instead, she saw Dr. Thompson, the school principal, walking quickly toward the nurse's office. There was something about his purposeful stride that made her stomach drop. Inside the nurse's office, the door opened. "Dad," Alex said quietly, speaking for the first time since the incident. Mrs. Chen's eyes darted between Alex and Dr. Thompson, sudden understanding dawning on her face. Mrs. Wilson, who had been directed to come to the nurse's office, stepped in behind Dr. Thompson. The color drained from her face as she heard Alex's word. "Dad," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Dr. Thompson turned slowly, his face a masterpiece of controlled emotion. "Yes, Mrs. Wilson. Alex is my son." His voice was calm, professional, but carried an underlying steel that made everyone in the room stand straighter. "I believe we need to have a serious discussion about what happened in your classroom today." The revelation hit Mrs. Wilson like a physical blow. All these months of targeting Alex, of trying to break his spirit, and she had been doing it to the principal's son. But Dr. Thompson's next words made it clear that this fact shouldn't matter at all. However, he continued, "What we really need to discuss is how you've been treating all your students. Because this incident, while severe, appears to be part of a pattern." He held up his phone, showing emails from other parents, documenting complaints that had been quietly filed over the years. The nurse's office door opened again as Mr. Parker entered with a thick folder. "Sir, I have the surveillance footage from the science fair incident and the students' video recordings from today. Also, these are the documented incidents from my classroom observations over the past months." Alex reached into his backpack, pulling out his carefully maintained journal. "I have everything written down, Dad. Every day, every incident, with dates and witnesses." His voice was steady, despite the hardened glue pulling uncomfortably at his scalp. Mrs. Wilson sank into a chair, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. I didn't mean," she began, but stopped as students began appearing at the nurse's office window, holding up their phones, each containing video evidence of her actions. Dr. Thompson turned to the school nurse. "Mrs. Chen, please document everything and take photos. We'll need to call the police to file a report, and Alex will need medical attention to safely remove the adhesive." He placed a gentle hand on his son's shoulder, his professional demeanor cracking slightly as he looked at the damage to his child's hair. But Alex wasn't finished. He turned to Mrs. Wilson, his voice clear and strong. "I want you to know something," he said. "I never let you see me cry. Not because I wasn't hurt, but because my dad taught me that my dignity isn't determined by how others treat me, but by how I respond to that treatment." The hallway outside had grown crowded with students and teachers, all witnesses to this moment of truth. Many were nodding at Alex's words, some were filming, others were quietly crying. This wasn't just about one incident anymore, it was about every student who had ever faced discrimination but stayed silent. The story might have ended there, with Mrs. Wilson's actions exposed and consequences imminent. But what happened next would transform Riverside Middle School in ways no one could have predicted. Because sometimes it takes a moment of darkness to spark a real change, and the next few days would prove that one person's courage could light the way for many others to step forward and speak their truth. The emergency school board meeting was called for 7 o'clock that evening. As parents, teachers, and community members filled the gymnasium, there was none of the usual casual chatter. Instead, a serious silence hung in the air, broken only by the occasional whisper and the sound of chairs scraping against the floor. News of the incident had spread quickly through the small town. Local news vans parked outside the school, their cameras capturing the steady stream of people entering the building. Inside, the school board members sat at a long table, their faces grave as they reviewed the evidence spread before them. Dr. Thompson sat in the front row, his presence commanding respect not just as the principal, but as a father who had just witnessed his child being assaulted. Alex sat beside him, his hair carefully wrapped in a medical covering after the initial treatment at the hospital. The doctor had said it would take several careful sessions to remove all the glue without damaging his locks. Mrs. Wilson sat alone on the other side of the room, her lawyer beside her looking increasingly concerned as more evidence was presented. The videos from students' phones played on the large screen, leaving no doubt about the deliberate nature of her actions. The surveillance footage from the science fair followed, showing the calculated way she had poured water on Alex's project. But what really changed the tone of the meeting was when other students and former students began to speak. One by one, they stepped up to the microphone, sharing their own experiences. A shy girl with glasses spoke about how Mrs. Wilson had mocked her stutter during class presentations. A boy in a wheelchair described being told he was too much trouble to include in lab experiments. Parents shared emails they'd sent over the years, reporting similar incidents that had been somehow overlooked or dismissed. As each person spoke, Mr. Parker added their statements to the growing pile of evidence. He had been quietly documenting these incidents for months, building a case that showed this wasn't just about one student or one incident, it was about a pattern of behavior that had gone unchecked for far too long. The school board's decision was unanimous. Mrs. Wilson's teaching contract was terminated immediately. But the consequences didn't stop there. The police officer present at the meeting stepped forward, explaining that charges would be filed for assault and battery of a minor. Dr. Thompson stood up then, and the room fell silent. Everyone expected anger, maybe even calls for revenge. Instead, he spoke about change. "What happened to my son was terrible," he began, his voice steady but emotional. But focusing only on punishment won't solve the deeper problems. We need to look at why this was allowed to continue for so long. We need better systems for reporting and investigating complaints. We need training for our staff about unconscious bias. Most importantly, we need to create an environment where every student feels safe speaking up when something is wrong. The board members nodded, taking notes. One of them, a longtime educator herself, proposed immediate changes, mandatory cultural sensitivity training for all staff, a new anonymous reporting system for students, and regular reviews of classroom dynamics by independent observers. Alex raised his hand to speak. The board chairman nodded, and he walked to the microphone. The room held its breath, wondering what this young man, who had endured so much, would say. "I kept a journal of everything that happened," he said, holding up his notebook. "Not for revenge, but because my dad taught me that documentation is how you create change. I'd like to help create a student committee that can work with teachers and administrators to make sure everyone's voice is heard." The suggestion was met with enthusiastic applause. Several teachers immediately volunteered to help organize the committee. Students in the audience started raising their hands, eager to participate. As the meeting continued, something remarkable happened. What had started as a response to a horrible incident was transforming into a movement for positive change. Parents were networking, forming support groups. Teachers were proposing new training programs. Students were organizing peer support systems. Mrs. Wilson's lawyer led her out of the building, past the news cameras and reporters. But inside, nobody noticed her leaving. They were too busy planning for the future, turning a moment of darkness into an opportunity for light. The meeting ran late into the evening, but nobody wanted to leave. There was an energy in the room, a sense that this could be the beginning of real transformation. As Dr. Thompson watched the crowd break into working groups, each focused on a different aspect of school reform, he put his arm around Alex's shoulders. "You know," he said quietly, "sometimes the worst things that happen to us become the catalyst for the best changes we can make. You've started something important here, son." Alex looked around the gym, seeing hope and determination on every face. He understood then that this wasn't just about justice for one incident, it was about making sure no student would ever have to face what he had faced alone again. Spring had come to Riverside Middle School, bringing with it more than just blooming flowers and warmer days. 3 months after the incident, the school halls buzzed with a different kind of energy. Where there had once been whispered tensions, there was now open dialogue. Where there had been silence, there were now voices ready to speak up. Alex sat in his new science classroom, looking around at the positive changes that had taken their root. The walls were covered with student projects celebrating diversity in science, featuring inventors and researchers from all walks of life. Their new teacher, Ms. Lee, had transformed the space into something welcoming and inspiring. Today, Ms. Lee announced with a warm smile, "We're going to learn about how different cultural perspectives have contributed to scientific discovery." She clicked to a slide showing various traditional medicines that had led to modern medical breakthroughs. The students leaned forward, engaged and curious. The door opened and a small group of visitors entered. Educators from other schools in the district coming to observe the changes that had made Riverside a model for positive transformation. They watched as students freely shared their thoughts and experiences, connecting scientific concepts to their own diverse backgrounds. During lunch, Alex headed to the library for the weekly meeting of the Student Voice Committee, the group he had proposed during that crucial board meeting. What had started with 10 students had grown to over 50 members, representing every grade and background in the school. "The anonymous reporting system is working really well," reported one committee member, showing graphs of how quickly concerns were being addressed. "Teachers are responding to feedback, and students say they feel heard." Another student added, "The 6th graders said they feel safer knowing they can report problems without fear." The room nodded in agreement, remembering how different things had been just a few months ago. The medical treatments to remove the glue from Alex's hair had been successful, though it had taken several careful sessions. His locks were healthy and strong, now a symbol of resilience that inspired others. Younger students would sometimes touch their own hair proudly, knowing the school now actively celebrated their differences instead of trying to suppress them. Dr. Thompson had kept his promise about systemic change. The school now had monthly cultural competency workshops for staff, and a diverse committee of parents helped review school policies. The anonymous reporting system had already prevented several potential incidents, catching problems before they could escalate. But perhaps the most significant change was in the students themselves. The incident had taught them the power of standing together, of documenting wrongs, and of speaking up. When a new student arrived at Riverside, they weren't just welcomed, they were actively included, with other students making sure they knew about all the support systems in place. One sunny afternoon, Alex passed by his old science classroom. It looked different now, brighter, more welcoming. Through the window, he could see Ms. Lee leading an after-school science club. Students of all backgrounds worked together on projects, their excitement visible in their animated discussions and bright eyes. "Quite a change, isn't it?" Mr. Parker said, walking up beside him. The teacher who had helped document everything now ran workshops for other schools about creating inclusive classrooms. "Your courage started all of this, you know." Alex shook his head modestly. "It wasn't just me. It was everyone who spoke up at that meeting. Everyone who shared their stories. Everyone who decided things needed to change." Later that day, at a special assembly, the superintendent of schools visited to announce that Riverside's new programs would be implemented district-wide. As she spoke about the importance of creating safe and inclusive spaces for all students, Alex sat in the audience, feeling proud but thoughtful. His father had been right. Dignity wasn't about how others treated you, but about how you responded to that treatment. The incident that could have broken his spirit had instead sparked a movement that was changing lives. After school, Alex walked through the halls one last time before heading home. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, highlighting the new artwork on the walls. student pieces celebrating diversity, unity, and strength. He passed the science fair display case, where his partially damaged sustainable energy project now had a special place, along with a plaque telling its story. A group of sixth graders waved to him as they headed to their own committee meeting, the next generation already learning to use their voices for positive change. Alex waved back, knowing that the real success wasn't just in the changes that had been made, but in the ones that would continue to grow long after he moved on to high school. As he walked home that spring afternoon, Alex realized that sometimes the worst moments in life could lead to the best changes, not just for one person, but for an entire community. The story of what happened at Riverside Middle School wasn't just about one incident anymore. It had become a story of transformation, of healing, and of how courage and compassion could turn darkness into light.